mother gave her obese daughter to a Navajo warrior because she was ugly, but he loved her like a wife. That's what folks whispered in hushed tones beneath the creaking boards of the trading post and around the smoky hearths of frontier cabins. They said the girl was too wide for love, too slow for beauty, too soft for a mother's pride. So when her mother handed her off to a stranger in beads and buckskin, no one spoke up. But the warrior didn't turn away. He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He looked her in the eyes and stayed. Why would a man feared for his silence choose a girl the world had thrown away? And how could love take root in the dust of such cruelty? The answers lay deep in the canyons, where hearts heal slower than bones, and kindness rides in the shadow of pain. When the dust settles and the fire dies low, one truth lingers. Sometimes the broken carry the strongest hearts, and sometimes the ones cast aside are the ones who save us all. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories still matter, that they speak to something true in all of us. If you believe in the power of redemption, quiet strength, and love that sees deeper than the surface, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories like this one. The sky was still dark when Ruth's mother woke her with a sharp whisper. The air inside the cabin smelled of old wood smoke and bitterness. Ruth blinked herself awake, her breath visible in the chill. "Get up!" her mother hissed, already pulling a coarse wool blanket over her daughter's broad shoulders. There was no kindness in the gesture, only speed and something cold in her eyes. "Don't argue, just do what I say." Ruth rose slowly, her joints stiff from another night on the floor. Her body, heavy and aching, moved with the sluggish rhythm of someone used to being unwanted. Outside, the frost clung to the dry weeds like glass teeth. The dirt road, still shadowed by the ridgeline, led straight into the waking town. They walked without words. Ruth's bare feet were tucked into boots one size too small. Her mother said nothing as they passed the church, the feed store, the schoolhouse, each building staring back at them like silent judges. A rooster crowed once and was answered by a mutter of wind. Behind lace curtains, eyes followed. Ruth had long known she was a disappointment. Too large, too soft, too quiet. Her mother had said it often enough. "You eat like a mule and move like a boulder," she would snap. "Ain't no man gonna want a girl like you." But even in all her cruel talk, Ruth never imagined this morning would come. The wagon sat at the edge of town like a shadow waiting to be claimed. A man stood beside it, tall, wrapped in deerskin, his hair braided back in rows. His face gave nothing away. A coil of rawhide rope hung from his belt, though no weapon showed. He looked like he belonged to the desert itself, dry, wind-worn, carved from silence. Ruth had seen him before, once, twice, trading with the blacksmith or bringing pelts for salt. Folks called him the Navajo ghost, said he spoke to no one, slept in the high cliffs, lived with spirits. Her mother approached him with the stiff posture of someone pretending not to be afraid. Ruth stayed back, heart pounding. She could hear her mother's voice, but not the words. A gesture, a point. A glance back at her, like she wasn't a person, but a thing to be inspected. Then a nod from the man. Final, unquestioning. Her mother turned on her heel and walked away, without so much as looking back. Ruth stood frozen, the world tilted. Her hands trembled under the weight of the blanket. The man said nothing. He motioned to the wagon with his chin. She climbed up. Wooden slats creaking beneath her. The bench was cold. He took the reins and flicked them once. The wheels rolled forward. Behind her, the town receded like a bad memory. A curtain lifted. A face disappeared. No one called her name. No one asked if she was all right. Her mother disappeared into the morning fog, her back rigid, her heart unreachable. Ruth held the blanket tighter around herself, trying to disappear. The man did not speak. His eyes faced forward. The land swallowed the path behind them, and the silence between them deepened. She was not a daughter anymore, not a burden, not even a girl, just a body in a wagon headed toward a life she had no say in. She did not cry. She did not ask why. In her mind, there were no answers worth hearing, only questions best buried beneath the red dust of the mesa. The wagon creaked over the dusty trail, wheels biting into the sand as the morning light peeled away the chill. Ruth sat stiff and silent, her hands gripped tightly in her lap beneath the folds of the blanket. She stole glances at the man driving the wagon, trying to read his face, searching for signs of what kind of man he was. But Tocho remained a statue, his jaw set, eyes ahead, his body as still as the stone mesas rising around them. The only sound was the wind slipping through dry brush and the occasional shuffle of the horse's hooves. Ruth expected harsh words, sharp glances, maybe even a hand raised. That's what she knew of men. That's what she'd learned from her mother's lovers, from townsfolk who spoke with barbed tongues. But this man was nothing. No anger, no kindness, just stillness. She couldn't decide if that was better or worse. When the sun climbed high, he stopped the wagon beneath the shade of a twisted juniper tree. Without a word, he handed her the water flask. He drank only after she had finished. Then he handed her a strip of dried meat and a chunk of hard bread. She took them, not speaking. When they rode again, her belly was no longer empty, but her heart felt heavier than ever. The hours passed. The land turned from cracked scrub to red stone rising in towers and walls. By the time the sky began to shift toward gold, they turned off the trail onto a path nearly hidden between two towering cliffs. The walls closed in like a canyon, swallowing them whole. Then suddenly the world opened again into a hidden valley ringed by rock. Tocho pulled the wagon to a stop before a house built into the stone. It wasn't large, but it looked sturdy. Part cave, part cabin. Smoke curled from a small chimney. A corral stood nearby with one horse inside. There was no other soul in sight. No women, no children, no signs of laughter or life beyond survival. A single flute lay on a wooden bench outside the door, worn smooth by years of use. Tocho stepped down and nodded for Ruth to follow. He led her inside without touching her, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. The room smelled of cedar and dust. He pointed to a side room. She stepped in and found a bed made of piled blankets, a folded quilt, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a basin of water, and a small fire already lit in the stone hearth. There were no locks, no bars, no command to stay, just a space that was clearly meant to be hers. He turned and left her there. Ruth stood alone, the fire's glow flickering against the walls. She touched the blanket, thick and soft beneath her fingers. She looked at the bread still warm. Her eyes stung. No one had prepared a space for her before. No one had thought she might need warmth, quiet, or privacy. That night she lay in the bed, curled into herself, and cried until the pillow beneath her was wet. She cried not from fear of Tocho, but from the hollow that her mother had left in her chest. She cried because she didn't understand why this stranger had not hurt her, not used her, not even spoken a cruel word. She cried because silence could be more terrifying than hate when you didn't know what it meant. She drifted into sleep with her heart braced for rejection. But when morning came, the fire was still lit. The coals had been tended. Near the door rested a small bowl of fresh berries, a cup of water, and a folded piece of cloth for washing. No words, no footsteps. Just small kindnesses left without witness or explanation. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the simple offering. She didn't know what to make of this man, this place, this quiet. But for the first time, the silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like the beginning of something she did not yet understand. The days passed without the sound of a single spoken word. The silence between them remained thick. but it was not cruel. Ruth moved through it like a cautious traveler crossing a frozen lake, testing each step, expecting the crack of danger. But the ice held. Each morning, she awoke to the scent of smoke and firewood already burning. Each night, a bowl of food would appear outside her door. Beans, squash, wild bread, sometimes meat. She never saw him prepare it. She never heard the door open. It was just there, like the sunrise. She didn't run. She could have, maybe, if she'd waited until he was out hunting or riding. But the land stretched forever in every direction, dry and red and unforgiving. There were no rivers, no shade, no roads, only cliffs and cactus, sun and silence. She had no map, no horse, and no illusions. She didn't stay because she was trapped. She stayed because she knew there was no one waiting for her out there. No mother, no friend, no kindness. So she stayed and watched him. From the shadow of the doorway, she would observe Tocho's movements. His hands were skilled, quiet in their labor. He carved leather straps, stitched a saddlebag, mixed herbs in a stone bowl. He moved with a stillness that felt ancient. Sometimes he walked out beyond the ridge to check on the sick horse that limped around the edge of the corral. He whispered to it, never to her, but never with anger. Not once did he slam a door or curse the ground or throw a single glance of contempt her way. Ruth waited for the disgust to surface, the revulsion that had lived in her mother's eyes, but it never came. It was as if her size, her awkwardness, her shame, none of it registered. She simply was. And in that, something inside her loosened. She began to sweep the dust from her room. She found a cracked dish and scrubbed it clean with sand and water. She organized the handful of possessions she had brought with her: a comb, a worn scarf, a thin booklet of psalms she couldn't bring herself to read anymore. She folded her blankets. She shaped her space. One morning she hummed, just a note rising in her throat without permission. Later that day she sang, softly as she wiped down the inside of the window with her sleeve. Lullabies, the ones her grandmother used to sing back before the sickness took her. Her voice was rusty, unsure, but the sound comforted her. It made her feel real again. That evening, after the sun dropped behind the cliffs and the wind turned cooler, she opened her door and found something new. Her meal had been placed not in the usual bowl, but on a wooden tray shaped like a crescent moon. Its edges were worn smooth, but delicate carvings remained. Roses, tiny and blooming along the rim. She ran her fingers along the ridges. It had been made with care, long ago, by someone who had once known beauty. She stared at it for a long time, the wind stirring her hair, the stars beginning to prick through the dusk. He had given it to her. Without ceremony, without explanation, without a single word. And for Ruth, that meant more than 1,000 speeches. Ruth hadn't meant to pry. She wasn't looking for secrets or stories, only for something to dust. It had started simply. A corner shelf thick with cobwebs, a table dulled by years of untouched use. But as her hands moved, as her fingers lifted one item after another, the silence of the house began to speak. There was a pair of leather shoes tucked neatly under a bench near the hearth. The soles were soft and thin, worn by steps much smaller than her own. Ruth picked one up, turned it in her hands. The stitching was delicate, the shape narrow, made for a woman with dainty feet. No one had worn them in years. Dust lined the inside like ash. She didn't put them back right away. She held them for a moment longer, as if trying to feel the feet that had once filled them. Near the back room, she found a woven basket, inside it a cloth-wrapped bundle. When she lifted the edge, she saw a child's doll, simple, handmade, with yarn hair and eyes stitched in faded black thread. The arms were frayed. One button was missing from the dress. Ruth didn't move it. She only replaced the cloth gently and set the basket back where she found it. On the mantel, there sat a glass jar with dried roses sealed inside. Their color had long since faded, but they held shape, as if the memory of their bloom clung tight against time. The petals curled inward, like shy hands. There were no vases, no flowers fresh or fragrant, only these brittle remnants, kept in glass, unbreathing but preserved. This wasn't a house, not really, it was a shrine. Each object, each forgotten pair of shoes, each dusty piece of embroidery, each doll and dish and pressed flower, spoke not of decoration, but of someone once cherished, of a life that had filled the space with laughter, scent, music, and now that life was gone. What remained was Tocho and his silence. Ruth stood in the center of the main room, the broom loose in her hand. She turned in a slow circle, letting the house reveal itself in pieces. The kitchen table hadn't been set for two in a long while. The shelves held no children's toys, but their absence was a presence in itself. The cabin wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. She began to clean with more care then. She moved slowly, gently, as if touching the edges of someone else's grief. She didn't rearrange. She didn't throw anything away. She only cleared the dust, swept the floors, polished the windows to let the light in, not to erase what had been, but to honor it. That night, as the firelight flickered low, Ruth heard something new, a sound like breath made into music, soft, tentative, rising into the night. Tocho was playing the flute. She didn't go to him. She stayed in her room, back against the wall, blanket drawn to her chest. But her eyes filled with tears as she listened. The notes were not sharp or proud. They were low and aching, as if each one cost him something to give. There was a sorrow in the song that clung to the walls like mist, winding through the cracks of the home and curling around her like a memory not her own. She pressed her hand to her heart. She didn't understand the whole story, but she understood this much. The silence wasn't made of stone. It was made of pain. And Tocho, he wasn't cruel. He was grieving. The days took on a new rhythm, not marked by words, but by gestures, by quiet exchanges between two people learning how to live beside one another. Tocho never asked anything of Ruth, but one morning there was a small basket by the door filled with berries, their deep reds and purples gleaming in the early light. Next to it, a folded scrap of cloth and a needle. She understood, a suggestion, not a command. So she took the cloth and began to mend the torn satchel that lay near the hearth. Her stitches were crooked, but they held. That afternoon, she saw him leading the sick horse from the corral. It still limped, favoring its left leg. Ruth waited until he walked away, then stepped into the corral with a small pail of oats. She held it steady as the horse approached. Its breath was hot and slow. She whispered softly, not for the animal's sake, but for her own comfort. The horse didn't shy from her. It ate. She wasn't strong, not yet. Her arms ached after scrubbing pots. Her back screamed after fetching water from the creek that ran between two jagged stones. But her breath came easier with each day. Her thighs no longer burned after every step. Her hands, once soft and unsure, grew steady. The weight she carried, the shame, the stillness, the belief that she was only a burden, began to shift. She wasn't starving. Tocho fed her well, but now she moved, lifted, pulled, cleaned, fed, created. The change came slowly, not in her size but in her strength. She didn't weigh less. She simply began to carry herself differently, not hunched in apology, but upright in quiet dignity. Tocho watched her from a distance, his gaze unreadable. At first, Ruth feared he was waiting for her to fail. But as the days passed, she saw something else in his eyes. Not pity, never that, but recognition maybe. Like he understood what it meant to try, to rebuild from ruin. He never interfered, never corrected her. When she made mistakes, burned the bread, dropped a bucket, he simply fixed what needed fixing without scorn. And when she succeeded, when the bag she stitched held its shape, or the soup she cooked filled the cabin with warmth, he nodded once and moved on. One morning Ruth woke to a glimmer at her door, a necklace, strung with beads the color of clay and ash, sun and earth, each one smooth and cool to the touch. No note, no explanation, just a simple, handmade offering. Ruth held it in her hands for a long while, heart thudding. She had never been given jewelry before. She had been given chores, insults, heavy silences, but never beauty. She placed it around her neck and stepped outside. The sky was pale with morning, the cliffs kissed with gold. Tocho was already tending the fence. He didn't look her way, but when she passed him on her way to gather wood, he gave the smallest nod, and that was enough. The storm rolled in without warning, the sky darkening like bruised fruit, low thunder murmuring against the cliffs. Rain came in thick sheets, drumming on the stone roof and slapping the hard-packed earth. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed and flared, its light dancing over the walls as wind howled through the cracks in the windows. Ruth sat cross-legged near the hearth, the heat brushing her cheeks, her hands curled around a tin cup of tea she hadn't touched. Across the room, Tocho sat in his usual silence, whittling a piece of wood into something that had not yet taken shape. She hadn't meant to speak. The words had sat in her chest for weeks, unformed, heavy. But something about the storm outside, the way it rattled the shutters and cloaked the world in sound, loosened her tongue. She turned slightly toward him, her voice low and clear. "Why didn't you say no to her?" Tocho didn't look up right away, his hands stilled. The knife hovered in place, poised just above the grain. The fire cracked loudly, sending sparks into the air like tiny stars. He stared into it, as if the flames held the answer instead of the question. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd ignore it, or pretend not to understand. But then he spoke, quietly, without hesitation. "Because you didn't deserve to be left like that. No more. No less." He didn't explain himself. He didn't soften it. He just let the words settle between them like embers falling into ash. Ruth looked down at her cup. The tea had gone cold. Her fingers tightened around it, not from anger, but from something deeper, something cracked open by his answer. It wasn't pity in his voice. It wasn't guilt. It was truth. She had been left like trash beside the road, and he had picked her up, not to keep her, not to claim her, but to spare her from that kind of ending. She swallowed the lump in her throat. The firelight shimmered in her eyes. She didn't cry, not this time, but her chest ached with the pressure of tears she chose not to shed. Instead, she nodded slowly, once, the gesture small but rooted. Tocho returned to his carving. The moment passed, but something had shifted. The silence between them wasn't the same. It no longer held suspicion or uncertainty. It was warmer now, like the heat of the fire, quiet, steady, and alive. Ruth leaned back against the wall, drawing the blanket up over her knees. She stared into the flames, thinking of all the stories she'd believed about herself, that she was unwanted, unworthy, ugly. A mistake. But Tocho hadn't seen a mistake. He had seen someone who should not have been discarded. She wasn't traded. She wasn't sold. She was rescued. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was a calm that held fast. Not love, not yet, but something just as sacred. A beginning, a truth, a small flame, refusing to die. The days after the storm settled into a strange stillness, the kind that made the cabin feel more like a church than a home. Tocho returned to his old rhythm, his footsteps soft, his presence steady but distant. He didn't speak, but he never had to. Ruth could feel the quiet weight pressing heavier on him now. There was a new kind of silence between them, not cold, but solemn, as though something had been disturbed, and now he was trying to put the pieces back in order without shattering them completely. She watched him more closely than before. His movements remained purposeful, but when his fingers brushed the doll in the basket, or when he passed the shoes near the hearth, she saw a tremble in his hands, barely there, but undeniable. Once, while in town to trade, a child cried out behind them in the general store. Ruth felt him go still beside her. His jaw tensed, his hands clenched. Then he left the store without a word. That night Ruth sat near the fire, pretending to mend a tear in her skirt while watching Tocho from the corner of her eye. He sat on the bench outside, the flute in his lap, unmoving. The sky behind him was stained with stars, the moon a thin scar above the cliffs. He didn't play. He just stared out into the dark, as if searching for something long gone. Ruth's fingers stilled. The thread slipped from her hand. She knew pain when she saw it, and his was the kind that wasn't loud. It had rooted deep, curling inward like a thorn no one dared pull out. She set the skirt aside and stood in the doorway, heart pounding with the weight of her own courage. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. Tocho didn't turn, didn't flinch. The wind moved across the canyon like a whisper, but he remained still. After a long moment, he rose, stepped past her, and went inside. He didn't answer. Ruth didn't press. She didn't follow. She simply returned to her room and sat on her cot, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The silence that night felt different. It didn't scare her. It didn't confuse her. It hurt. When she woke the next morning, she found the flute resting just outside her door, its carved body glinting with dew. She touched it gently, then noticed the edge of something tucked into her blanket, a folded piece of parchment, carefully sealed with a strip of red ribbon. Her fingers shook as she opened it. 2 pages, one side written in English, the other in Navajo. The words were plain, unadorned. "My wife died giving birth. I was too far to reach her. The baby girl cried once, then never again. Fever took her in days. I buried them both with my own hands. I did not speak for a year. I built the house for them. I kept it for them. Until you came." Ruth held the letter to her chest, breath caught in her throat. There were no flourishes, no pleas for sympathy, only truth, grief laid bare. She sat for a long time, the morning sun casting golden light across the floor. She thought of the doll, the shoes, the roses in the jar, all the things that had once belonged to a life that ended too soon, a home that had not heard laughter since, and a man who had chosen silence over madness. Now she understood. He had not saved her because he wanted a companion. He had saved her because he had once lost everything. And maybe, just maybe, some part of him believed that saving someone else might save what little remained of himself. The whispers began like dust devils, small, scattered, easy to ignore at first. Then they gathered, louder, sharper, cruel. When Ruth and Tocho rode into town for supplies, the stillness in the street told her something had shifted. Folks didn't speak to them directly. They didn't need to. Their eyes spoke well enough. Women paused at the pump and stared. Men leaned on railings and spat hard into the dirt when they passed. The blacksmith, who once nodded to Tocho, now turned his back. The storekeeper's smile was tight, his hands twitching as he rang up their goods. Even the preacher's wife, who had once offered Ruth a biscuit as a child, looked away like she was ashamed of ever having done so. Ruth kept her eyes on the floor, her fingers clutching the sack of flour against her chest. She felt her face burn as the words floated past her like smoke. "That's her, the fat one. Lives out there with that savage now. Her mama sold her like a pig, and the Injun took her in. She heard it all, though none of it was said to her face. Not that it needed to be. The voices carried just loud enough to wound, and the silence in between them cut deeper. Each whisper fed the next, twisted with old superstitions and fresh malice. Ruth had always known she was judged, but this was something darker. It didn't take long for the worst of them to step from the shadows. Mr. Calder, a land baron with a jaw like a meat hook and hands too clean for the work he claimed to do. He was a man who dressed in city leather but walked like he owned the earth. Years ago, he had tried to buy Tocho's land under the pretense of expanding the rail line. The town knew it. The elders had refused. The documents disappeared. The land stayed untouched. But Calder never forgot a debt, and he never forgave a no. Now he had a new weapon. Unnatural, Calder said one afternoon at the saloon, loud enough for every ear in the room. That pairing, Savage and Sal, it's indecent. He spoke with mock concern, but his eyes were hard, calculating. He knew the rail company still had interest in cutting through the mesa, knew that Tocho's land sat right in the way, and now with a girl like Ruth living under his roof. Calder saw a crack in the warrior's reputation, a way to stir the town's fear and make a case for legal interference. They ain't married, ain't kin. She's just there, living with him, unwatched, untouched. What does that make her? What does that make him? He asked, letting the question poison the air. Ruth didn't know all the details, not yet, but she felt the pressure mounting like thunder behind the hills. She saw it in the way Tocho's jaw clenched when they left town, in the way his shoulders tightened just before mounting the horse. He didn't speak of it, didn't give the whispers breath. But his silence that night was heavier than ever. Back at the cabin, Ruth sat beside the fire, her hands in her lap. Tocho sharpened a blade slowly, methodically, the rasp of stone on steel filling the room. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. It carried the whispers with it, whispers that called her shameful, unnatural, unwanted. She stared into the flames and realized the piece they had carved out together was no longer hidden. It was exposed, and something was coming for it. Trouble had a name now, and it was Calder. The first time Ruth saw Ada, she wasn't sure if the woman had stepped out of the desert or the sky. She arrived without announcement, her figure emerging from the horizon like a shadow drawn by the wind. Wrapped in faded woven cloth and crowned with long silver hair tied back in a thick braid. Her back was straight, her steps certain. A bundle of herbs swayed on her shoulder, clutched tight with a handful of sun-darkened rings and time-worn fingers. Tocho met her at the edge of the corral with a quiet nod, one hand over his chest. Ruth, watching from the doorway, didn't know what to do. Ada turned her eyes on her, and Ruth felt something stir. Those eyes weren't judging. They weren't curious. They were knowing. "Hello, little one," Ada said in a voice low and dry like the rustle of corn husks. "I've heard your singing." Ruth blinked, startled. "My singing?" Ada gave a soft, amused smile. "You hum when you sweep. You think no one hears, but the wind carries everything." That afternoon, Ada settled inside the cabin, as though she had always belonged there. She laid out herbs in neat bundles across the table, identifying each one in both Navajo and English. Some cured wounds, some soothed breath, some were for bad dreams. She worked as she talked, her words like a current pulling Ruth in. "I knew Tocho's mother," Ada said, "and his wife. I held their hands when the world was kind. I buried them when it wasn't." Ruth didn't know what to say. She had never known women who carried loss like honor. Ada did not speak of tragedy as if it had broken her. She spoke as if it had shaped her bones. Later, as the sun dipped low and the fire filled the room with gold, Ada sat beside Ruth and took her hand. "Your voice is soft," she said, "but it carries truth. Your body is strong, even if it has been called weak, and your face, she paused, lifting Ruth's chin gently. Your face is not ugly. It is unblossomed. That is different. No one had ever spoken to Ruth like that. Not her mother, not the town, not even herself. You think you are unworthy, Ada went on, because others could not see your spirit. But I see it. So does he. Ruth turned to glance at Tocho, who stood near the window, watching the fading light. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ada smiled again, softer this time. There is something sacred growing here, between you. It will frighten people who do not understand it. They will call it wrong. They will try to burn it before it roots. She looked to Tocho then, her eyes sharp. The town plots like snakes in a drought. They're hungry and they will strike. Be ready. Ruth listened. She listened with more than her ears. She listened with her heart. Ada was more than a visitor. She was a mirror, a lantern, a warning bell. Over the following days, Ada remained, teaching Ruth the meaning of certain stories etched in the stones, the songs of the wind at dusk, and the symbols on the worn tray where her food was sometimes left. Roses, yes, but also protection. Ruth began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Rooted. She wasn't drifting anymore. She was growing. Ada stayed for 3 days, then left with the same quiet grace she arrived with, but not before pressing a pouch of dried herbs into Ruth's hand. For strength, she said, for truth, and for love that dares to grow where hate has lived too long. And just like that, Ruth was no longer alone. The morning started with the sharp smell of smoke on the wind. Ruth was kneeling near the corral, filling a water trough, when she noticed the sky stained gray in the distance. Not the soft, sweet smoke of campfires or cooking, but a thick, angry plume curling up from the dry field beyond the ridge. She stood slowly, heart rising in her throat. Tocho stepped out of the barn a moment later, already watching the same sky, his face unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Calder's men had come close enough to be seen, but not so close that the law could be blamed. It wasn't a fire to claim land. It was a warning. Leave or we'll burn the rest. Tocho said nothing for a long time. He only walked back to the cabin and began to prepare. He moved without panic, but with purpose. The doors were checked, the windows reinforced with wood slats. The horses were led deeper into the canyon, hidden in a place only he knew. The tools near the firewood stack were sharpened, oiled, then set aside, not for use but for readiness. Not once did he lift a weapon in anger. He prepared as one who had already faced loss and knew how to survive it. Ruth followed him closely. When he tried to do everything alone, she stepped in. She gathered stones for the windowsills, hauled water to fill every available container, swept the floors not out of duty but out of need, to keep moving, to stay steady. When he came back with sacks of dried beans and grain to be stored in the root cellar, she helped him stack them in the cool earth. He never told her no. He never asked her to stop. He let her stand beside him. As the sun set that day, painting the cliffs in blood and copper, they sat near the fire, saying nothing. The tension pressed on the walls like a second storm waiting to break. Ruth curled near the hearth, her head resting against a folded blanket. She felt heavy, but not afraid. Not exactly. Fear had changed shape in her. It no longer looked like running. It looked like fighting quietly, for a place, for a life, for dignity. That night she dreamed of a garden. In the dream, the field was green. Vines curled up wooden stakes. Rows of tomatoes gleamed red in the sun. She was barefoot, hands covered in dirt, laughter in her mouth. Tocho stood beside her, planting corn, his sleeves rolled up, his face at peace. The earth was warm, the wind gentle, and for once everything felt still and safe. When she woke in the dim morning light, the fire had died to embers. but the dream clung to her like dew. Tocho was already moving, pulling the last stones from the tool shed. She rose, rubbed her eyes, and walked outside. The air smelled clean again, but the memory of smoke lingered just under the wind. Ruth found him kneeling beside the cabin, dragging a rock from the dry, stubborn soil. Without a word, she dropped beside him and began pulling up stones of her own. Tocho paused, looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "If we make it through," he said softly, "we'll plant one." She met his eyes, her hands steady on the dirt. "Let's begin now," she replied. And together, before the threat had even passed, they started making space for something new to grow. The news came on a dry wind, and a cloud of dust kicked up by a horse's hooves. Ruth saw the rider long before she heard his voice. The black coat, the gleam of a badge, the way even the horse beneath him looked uneasy in this place. A U.S. Marshal. Behind him, two of Calder's men stood, smug and sure, arms crossed as if the law belonged to them. Tocho stood in the doorway, silent, his arms folded. Ruth stepped beside him before he could speak. "I've come on official complaint," the marshal said, voice stiff with authority. "A man by the name of Elias Calder has filed a claim with the circuit court in Santa Fe. Says a girl by the name of Ruth was given unlawfully to an outsider, that she was not of age to make her own decision, that she was sold into servitude without witness or right." Ruth's breath caught, but she didn't step back. "She's to be returned," the marshal continued, unfolding a paper from his coat, "for questioning, for custody, until it's settled." Tocho's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Not yet, but Ruth did. Her voice was low, dry from fear, but it didn't shake. "I am not property," she said. The marshal blinked. "I was not sold," she went on. "I was abandoned, left on the side of the road like a sack of spoiled meat. He didn't take me. He gave me a place to stand." The two men behind the marshal laughed quietly. One muttered, "She talks now, does she?" Tocho took a step forward then, slow and calm. His hand rested on the frame of the doorway, not near a weapon, not threatening, but solid as stone. "Go back to Calder," he said evenly. "Tell him lies can't take root in red soil." The marshal hesitated. The law might wear a badge, but even lawmen understood when a line shouldn't be crossed too fast. Behind them, the sound of wheels drew near. A wagon rolled in from town, and behind it came feet, people walking, the townsfolk, some curious, some silent, some eager for spectacle. They gathered like sheep caught between fences, unsure which way to run. Then a voice broke through the hush. "I saw it happen," said the midwife. She stepped from the crowd, her gray braid loose over one shoulder, her eyes sharp. Her mother gave her away in broad daylight. No contract, no coin, just shame. "I was there. I remember." Ruth looked at the woman, stunned. They had never spoken before, but here she was. Then another voice. "Ada." She stepped from the trees like she'd been waiting, hands on her cane, her eyes bright as polished stone. "I confirm it," Ada said. "I heard the girl's mother say it herself. She didn't want her. She wanted to be rid of her. That man," she nodded toward Tocho, "picked up what the world dropped." The marshal looked down at the paper in his hand, then up at the people around him. They were quiet but no longer uncertain. Calder's men shifted uncomfortably. "I'll report what was said," the marshal muttered. "It'll take time. There'll be a hearing." "You bring whoever you want," Ada said. "This land knows the truth." Lines had been drawn, not with guns, not yet, but with voices, with courage. And Ruth, standing beside Tocho with her chin high and her hands steady, knew something had changed forever. The town had seen her. The law had heard her. And the name Calder no longer held the weight it once did. Evening came slow and heavy, the kind of twilight that settled over the land like a held breath. The canyon was still. Even the birds had gone quiet. The cabin stood firm against the coming dark, its windows lit from within like soft lanterns glowing in a sea of stone and shadow. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing warmth into the spaces between silence. Ruth moved with calm purpose, sweeping the floor one last time, straightening the jars on the shelf, tying bundles of herbs near the door. Tocho had just returned from the outer trail, where he'd laid stones and tied warning cloth to the brush. A quiet way of marking the land, a sign to the old ones, and maybe to something deeper, something he didn't name. They both knew what tomorrow might bring. She didn't ask him if he was ready. He didn't ask her if she was afraid. When the chores were done and the last pot had been pulled from the fire, they sat across from each other on the low rug near the hearth. Ruth picked up the flute, fingers uncertain at first, but guided by memory and the weight of the silence that asked for music. She played softly, hesitant at first, then fuller, each note drawn like a thread from her chest. Tocho closed his eyes, leaning slightly forward, not in exhaustion, but in surrender to the sound. The flute sang a song older than both of them, shaped by sorrow, but not chained to it. When she finished, she held the flute in her lap, fingers resting gently over its carved edges. "I dreamed of this," she said, her voice barely louder than the fire. "This place, this peace. I didn't know what it would look like, but now I do." Tocho opened his eyes. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. He didn't speak, but his eyes held something deep, something like reverence. Ruth reached out and rested her hand on his. The touch was light, but not uncertain. Not anymore. They didn't speak of love, not in words, but it moved between them in the warmth of the firelight, in the hush of the room, in the way his hand slowly turned beneath hers and held it back. It was in the stillness, in the absence of fear, in the decision to stay. "Whatever comes tomorrow," she said, voice low and clear, "I'm not afraid anymore." Tocho looked at her for a long moment before answering. His voice was deep, steady, and solemn. "Then you are stronger than most." They sat like that as the fire burned lower, as the wind outside shifted, as the moon rose above the cliffs, pouring silver light over the valley. The cabin glowed with a kind of sacred warmth, the kind not born from wood and flame, but from the presence of two people who had nothing left to prove, nothing to hide. They had come to this place broken, each in their own way. But tonight, on the edge of what could be the end, or the beginning, they were whole, and together. Dawn cracked across the valley like a bone splintering under weight. The sky was streaked with blood-orange light, and the earth held its breath. Dust rose in the east. Hooves thundered in rhythm, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Calder's men came like a storm. 6 riders, grim-faced, rifles slung across their backs, torches clenched in fists. At the front, Elias Calder sat tall in the saddle, black coat flapping like a crow's wing, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed with intent. He wasn't bluffing now. He meant to finish what he started. But they weren't alone. By the time the riders reached Willow Ridge, the long bluff overlooking Tocho's land, a crowd had gathered. Townsfolk, some curious, some afraid, many quiet but watching. They'd followed the whispers, followed the heat rising from Calder's threats and the strange strength growing out in the canyon. Now they had come to see for themselves who would stand and who would fall. Ruth stood at the edge of the bluff, unarmed, her feet planted firmly in the earth. Her dress was plain, her hair tied back, her hands empty, but she held herself tall. On one side stood Ada, wrapped in her ceremonial shawl, her face carved with calm certainty. On the other stood the midwife, her chin lifted, hands clasped in front of her. Neither looked away as Calder approached. Tocho stood a little behind them, beside the cabin. He held no weapon, made no move. He only watched, his presence steady as stone. Calder dismounted with flair, dust curling around his boots. He waved the paper in his hand like a blade. "This is legal," he said, voice booming. "The girl was taken without witness, without contract, into the custody of a savage. It's unlawful, immoral, and today it ends." Ruth stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I wasn't taken," she said. "I was thrown away." Calder sneered. "The girl's confused, brainwashed. Just look at her. She was always slow." "I was abandoned," Ruth said again, louder. "You want my body because you couldn't get the land." The crowd stirred. Whispers swelled. But before Calder could retort, Ada stepped forward, lifting a worn leather pouch from beneath her shawl. "Letters," she said, "from the mother, given to me the day she left the girl behind. She said, 'I've no more use for her,' wrote it down herself, signed it." She handed the papers to the marshal, who had arrived quietly and now stood to the side, brows furrowed. Then she pulled a second set of documents from her pouch. "Tocho's land is protected under the 1868 treaty," she said. "Federal recognition. Calder tried to buy it once and was refused. There are records." Calder turned red. "You've no right." But another voice cut through his fury. "Actually," said the man who had just stepped out from behind the crowd, "I do." The federal judge was older, but not frail. His coat was dusty from travel. His eyes were sharp behind wire spectacles. He held a seal in his hand, stamped in wax. "I was summoned weeks ago," he said, nodding to Ada. "Came quietly. Figured I'd best see the truth before it turned into a lie too big to fix." He took the documents from the marshal, read them slowly, and then looked at Calder. "This claim is baseless. The girl is free. The land is not for sale. You have no standing." Calder stepped forward sputtering, but two deputies moved from the crowd and took his arms. He resisted, then saw the rifles across their backs and stilled. His face twisted with hate. "This isn't over," he growled. "Yes, it is," Ruth said softly. "It ended the day I stopped being afraid." The crowd was silent. Then slowly, a few began to nod. The midwife laid a hand on Ruth's shoulder. Tocho stepped beside her, saying nothing, but standing close. The sun climbed higher, and the ridge, once a place of threat, now held the weight of justice. The judge's words hung in the morning air like a bell struck in the middle of church, sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. The girl is free. The land is sovereign and under protection. There is no case here, only cowardice pretending to be justice. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Calder did. He stepped forward, rage boiling in his eyes, his hand twitching toward his belt, as if years of getting his way could summon power from thin air. "You fools," he spat, voice shaking. "You'd let a savage keep land that should be rail and profit? You'd let a fat girl speak like a woman? This is what you call order?" The judge lifted his hand calmly. "Marshal," he said. In two swift strides, the marshal and a deputy closed in on Calder. He shoved one of them, but the other was faster. With practiced hands, they spun him around, binding his wrists with iron. He struggled, shouted, threw curses that clung to the dust like flies. But no one came to his defense. Not this time. The people of the town, those who had followed out of curiosity, who'd whispered and watched and judged from behind lace curtains, stood still. Then a few clapped, quiet at first, unsure, but then stronger. One woman nodded. A man near the back, who had once laughed at Ruth's size, removed his hat and placed it over his heart. Another muttered, "Wasn't right, what they did to her." And then came the applause, not loud, but real. Ruth stood at the center of it, her shoulders square, her face calm. The girl who had once been delivered like livestock now stood rooted like an oak. The shame that had clung to her for so long was gone, burned away by truth, courage, and something harder to name. She didn't need permission to exist anymore. She had taken it for herself. The sheriff, a man who had never once spoken more than a grunt to her before, stepped forward awkwardly. He scratched his chin and cleared his throat. "Miss Ruth," he said, voice stiff, "I reckon I owe you an apology. We all do." She didn't smile. She didn't dismiss his words. She just nodded, and that was enough. The midwife was next. She didn't speak at all. She just stepped forward and wrapped Ruth in a firm, sudden hug, the kind that didn't ask for permission, only offered comfort. Ruth closed her eyes and leaned in, letting the warmth of it settle through her bones. When she pulled back, her eyes found Tocho. He was standing a few steps away, not tense, not guarding, just watching her. The look in his eyes wasn't the distant caution of a protector or the solemn gaze of a man carrying grief. It was something else entirely. Love. Unspoken, yes, but full, unhidden. And then slowly, as if giving a gift wrapped in silence, Tocho smiled. Not the half smile he wore when grateful, not the polite nod he gave to strangers. This was full, deep, real. It was the smile of a man who had buried his heart long ago and now, against all odds, found it again. In the courage of a girl the world had once called unworthy. Ruth's hand went to her chest, not to hide it, but to feel the rhythm of something newly alive inside her. And around them, under the vast blue sky, the town saw it too. Not shame, not scandal, but a bond, a choice, a beginning. And in that moment, the canyon echoed not with gunfire or judgment, but with the quiet, unshakable sound of vindication. The earth was stubborn, dry and compacted. It fought every shovel and claw. But Ruth and Tocho worked it anyway. Side by side beneath the high desert sun, their hands were blistered, their backs sore, but neither complained. The cabin no longer stood in isolation. It stood as a beginning. Each row they carved into the soil was a promise. Tomatoes here, beans there, squash along the southern fence where the sun lingered longest. Ruth woke early each morning, pulling her hair back in a scarf, tying on gloves that were too big for her hands but good enough for the job. The air was cool when they started, but by noon sweat ran down her spine and soaked the back of her dress. She didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt strong, not because someone told her so, but because she could feel it in her limbs, in the way she moved without shame or fear. In the evenings, when the work was done and the tools were hung, Tocho would bring out the flute. He played soft melodies while Ruth sat on the porch, her legs folded beneath her, fingers brushing the pages of an old notebook where she scribbled words she couldn't always say aloud. Sometimes she sang, not to herself, not in secret, but openly, voice lifted to the open sky. Children from town began to wander up the path on weekends, drawn by curiosity and then by comfort. At first they came hesitantly, eyes wide, hands tucked in their pockets. But Ruth welcomed them with warm bread and gentle patience. She taught them songs she remembered from her grandmother's lap, verses about birds and rivers and dreams hidden in the hills. They sat in a circle in the garden's edge, their small voices weaving through the bean poles and tomato vines like a blessing. Ada returned often, her steps slower but her presence as sharp as ever. She watched from her place beneath the juniper tree, eyes squinting against the sun, mouth curled in a satisfied smile. "It grows," she said once, running her hand over the leaves of a young squash plant. "Just like I said it would." Ruth didn't hide anymore. Not behind shawls, not behind silence. Her body, once ridiculed, once used as a weapon against her, now moved with assurance. She carried water buckets without pause. She knelt in the dirt without apology. Her arms were soft but steady, her back curved but unbroken. She was not what the world called beautiful, but when she laughed full and open, eyes shining and hands on her hips, She was radiant, not because of how she looked, but because of how she lived. Tocho watched her often, not as a guardian, but as a man seeing the person he chose to stand beside. He never tried to change her. He only stood with her. And in the quiet moments, when their hands brushed while planting, or when he tied a loose strand of hair behind her ear, it was clear. She was no longer a guest in his world. She was home. And as the garden grew, winding green from the dust, so did she, rooted, reclaimed, alive. Ruth began writing late at night, when the moon hung low and the fire had dimmed to coals. The cabin was quiet, the wind whispering through the canyon stones like a voice too old to be angry anymore. She sat at the little table near the window, the flute resting on its cloth, her hands stained with ink and earth. There was no audience, no ambition, only the weight of stories she could no longer keep to herself. The first letter was to a girl she barely remembered, a neighbor's daughter, too thin and too loud, often silenced with slaps and sharp glares. Ruth had seen her once hiding behind the stable, clutching a doll with a cracked face. In the letter, Ruth wrote, "You are not what they said. You are not broken. You are only buried, and you will grow when the world least expects it." She didn't sign her name. More letters followed. Some were folded between pages of old books and left in the general store when she went into town. Others were tied with twine and tucked beneath wagon benches, slipped into church hymnals, or left with Ada, who knew where they needed to go. Each one carried a story, not always Ruth's, but always true, of girls who were given away, of women called too big, too plain, too strange, of pain transformed into strength, of love that came in silence and stayed. Some stories were shaped like fables. One told of a bear who was shunned for being too large, only to save the village when the river rose. Another told of a cactus that grew flowers brighter than any garden, but only when the night was darkest. The words were simple, the messages clear: respect, courage, compassion, seeds that could be carried in a pocket or a prayer. They spread slowly at first, but then whispers began, soft ones, like wind moving through dry grass. Did you read the letter someone left in the preacher's coat? There was one inside a flour sack, said my life was still worth something. She said I was more than my bruises. The townsfolk never knew who wrote them. They guessed. Some said it was Ada. Some thought it was the preacher's wife, but no one imagined it was the girl they once mocked, the one who had vanished into the desert and come back taller, fuller, unafraid. That was how Ruth preferred it. Her story wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing others. The girls who couldn't leave, the women too scared to speak, the mothers who had failed and wished for second chances. One evening, Tocho found her asleep at the table, her head resting on a page still wet with ink. He didn't wake her. He only lifted her gently, carried her to bed, and returned to the table. He read the letter once, then again. It said, "Even if they call you worthless, you still carry light. Let no one steal that from you." He folded it with care and placed it beside the others, ready to be carried into the world. And so Ruth became more than the girl who was left behind. She became the voice that followed women home, the story told in hushes and hopes, a ghost writer of truth, drifting on the wind, reminding the forgotten they were never alone. The first swing of the axe struck the old beam like thunder, echoing down the canyon walls. It was Tocho who began the work, but Ruth stood beside him, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, her hands steady on the measuring line. The cabin had been built for one, silent, tight, shadowed. Now it opened, little by little, to light, to laughter, to change. They added a second front door, not out of necessity, but meaning. One door had always been there, carved by loss, worn by grief. The other would be new, equal, Ruth's, her own path, her own choice, her own right to come and go with dignity. They built it together, hammer and nail, wood and sweat. Tocho shaped the frame, Ruth sanded the edges. When it was done, she carved a rose into the center, its petals wide and full, not delicate, but strong. They painted it red. People came, not all at once, but slowly in pairs and on their own, led by word and whisper. The girl who once lived with shame now welcomed others without it. Townsfolk brought bread, eggs, blankets. They didn't ask questions. They sat on the porch or by the fire. Some brought stories too heavy to carry alone. Some brought silence, needing only a place where they wouldn't be judged. The cabin became a place of rest. Children still came, laughing and wild. They helped water the garden, chasing butterflies between the rows. They pressed their palms into the wet earth and called it magic when the sprouts poked through. One boy asked if Ruth was a witch who turned pain into tomatoes. She smiled and told him no, but the earth listens better when spoken to kindly. Traders began to leave small gifts, stone carvings, fresh linen, rare seeds, not as payment, but thanks. A man with a limp said the tea Ruth brewed made him sleep for the first time in weeks. A widow said the letters she found at church saved her from herself. No one asked who wrote them. They only pressed them to their chest and wept. Ada came often, her steps slow, her smile quick. She sat near the rose bush that now bloomed wild at the foot of the new door. "It grows fast," she said one afternoon, touching a petal, "because it knows it's welcome." The ghosts were still there, but they had changed. No longer haunting, no longer bitter, just present, like the shadow of a loved one in a favorite chair or the memory of a voice in the sound of a flute. Tocho still played, but now the music carried warmth. It drifted across the valley in the evenings, curling through open windows, settling on the skin like a blessing. Ruth would often pause in the doorway, her doorway, and watch the people gathered, some laughing, some crying, some just breathing deeply for the first time in years. She would rest her hand on the frame, the carved rose smooth beneath her fingers, and smile. The house was no longer a shelter of sorrow. It was a home, with 2 doors, 2 hearts, and 100 open arms. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, stirring dust and sunlight in lazy spirals as the children gathered beneath the old juniper tree. They sat cross-legged in a crooked circle, eyes wide, hands fidgeting with small pebbles or wildflowers pulled from the field. An old woman sat among them, wrapped in a worn shawl that smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. Her hands were lined like riverbeds, and her voice, though softened by age, still carried the weight of stories that had weathered the years. "You ever seen that cabin yonder?" she asked, nodding toward the rise of land where the red rock met green earth. "The one with 2 doors, front and center, and a rose carved into one of them?" The children turned their heads as one, looking toward the old wooden house that stood quiet and proud, framed by climbing squash vines and blooming wild roses. 2 rocking chairs sat side by side on the porch, gently swaying though no wind touched them. "It's empty now," one boy whispered. The woman nodded. "It is, but not forgotten." "Who lived there?" asked a girl with braids and dust on her knees. "A girl," the old woman said, her eyes distant. "One the world thought too heavy, too slow, too much. Her own mother gave her away, right in front of God and everybody. Called her shame. Called her burden." The children grew quiet, leaning closer. "But there was a man," she continued, "a warrior, quiet as stone, scarred by sorrow. They said he was dangerous, said he lived with ghosts, and maybe he did. But when he saw that girl, he didn't see what the world saw. He saw her heart." "Did he save her?" another child asked. The old woman smiled. "She saved herself, but he gave her a place to do it." The wind stirred again, brushing the grass and lifting the edge of her shawl. The children waited, eyes fixed on the house. They built a garden, she went on, not just of food, but of kindness. Grew tomatoes and trust, beans and bravery. Folks started to come, people who'd been broken in other ways. And in that place, they found peace. Because of her, because of him. A boy with a stick poked at the dirt, then asked softly, "Did they love each other?" The woman's eyes twinkled. "Love like that doesn't fade. It teaches. It roots deep. So deep it grows, even when the people are gone." She looked back toward the house. The setting sun bathed the cabin in golden light, the porch glowing, the chairs still rocking, slow and steady. "And every so often," she whispered, "when the wind's just right, you can hear him playing the flute, soft and low, like he's calling her name. And sometimes, if your heart's quiet enough, you'll feel her smile in the warmth of the dusk." The children didn't speak after that. They just sat still, watching the cabin as the first star appeared in the deepening sky. And on the breeze that passed over them, cool and sweet, came the sound of a single flute note, faint but true.